December 14th, 1814, and the snow fell upon Ravenscroft Manor like a whispered secret, soft and relentless, blanketing the grounds in white, while inside the grandest bedchamber Eleanor Ashworth stood before the man she had just married, the man she had spent 2 years learning to despise, the man whose family name she had sworn upon her dying father's grave to destroy. The hour had grown late, nearly 11 in the evening, and 6 hours had passed since she had spoken. Vows she did not mean in a chapel she did not love. To a duke who watched her now with those impenetrable grey eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. She still wore her wedding gown of ivory silk adorned with seed pearls, a dress purchased with borrowed money and stitched with bitter purpose, and at her ears hung her mother's pearl earrings, the only inheritance left to her after the Sinclair family had stripped everything else away. Frederick Sinclair, the Duke of Ravenscroft, stood by the fireplace in his study where he had led her after the last of the wedding guests departed, and behind him hung a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and dark hair who must have been his mother, watching them both with an expression that seemed almost sorrowful. The fire crackled and spat, casting shadows that danced across the walls and illuminated the hard planes of his face, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she gathered the courage for what she must do next. He expected a bride trembling with anticipation or perhaps nerves, but he did not expect the truth, could never have anticipated the venom she had carried into his home, into his name, into this mockery of a marriage. She crossed the distance between them slowly, her silk skirts whispering against the carpet, and she watched confusion flicker briefly in his eyes when she did not stop at a proper distance, but instead drew close enough that she could smell the faint scent of brandy and winter air that clung to him. "I married you to destroy you," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the snow falling against the windows, and she watched his face for the explosion of rage she had been taught to expect from Sinclair men. The words hung between them like frost crystallizing on glass, and she continued because she could not stop now, could not retreat from the path she had chosen. "Your father ruined mine," she said, her voice growing stronger, though her hands trembled at her sides. "He destroyed our fortune, drove my father to poverty and madness, and I watched him die in a cramped London room with nothing but debts and a broken spirit." She lifted her chin and met his gaze without flinching. "So I found a way to become your wife, to enter your household, to learn your secrets and use them to bring down everything you love." The silence that followed was so complete that Eleanor could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears, could hear the distant creak of the ancient manor settling around them, could hear the soft hiss of snowflakes melting against the warm window panes. Frederick Sinclair did not move, did not shout, did not reach for her in anger or call for servants to remove her from his sight. He simply watched her with those grey eyes that had gone very still, and when he finally spoke, his voice was as calm as the winter night itself. "Then we understand each other at last," he said, and Eleanor felt the first cold tendril of doubt wrap itself around her vengeful heart. Frederick turned away from her then, moving toward the sideboard where a crystal decanter caught the firelight and scattered it into fragments of amber and gold, and Eleanor watched as he poured brandy into a glass with hands that remained impossibly steady, hands that did not tremble or shake despite the confession she had just laid at his feet like a gauntlet thrown in challenge. He did not drink, she noticed, merely held the glass and stared into its depths as though searching for words among the swirling liquid, and the portrait of his mother seemed to watch them both with that same sorrowful expression, bearing witness to this strange and terrible wedding night. "You speak of my father as though he were a man worth avenging yourself upon," Frederick said at last, his voice measured and careful in a way that made Eleanor realize he was choosing each word with deliberate precision. He was not. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, felt the careful architecture of her hatred begin to shift beneath her feet like ice cracking on a winter pond, and she did not know what to say to this man who should have been raging at her, who should have been calling for servants and solicitors and demanding an annulment on grounds of fraud. Instead, he stood there in the firelight, still holding the untouched brandy. And when he turned to face her again, she saw something in his grey eyes that looked almost like recognition, almost like the reflection of her own buried pain staring back at her across the shadows. "My father destroyed many things," Frederick continued, and his voice carried the weight of years of silence finally breaking. "He destroyed my mother's spirit before he destroyed her health. He destroyed my childhood with his cruelties, both large and small. He destroyed men who trusted him and families who had done nothing to deserve his particular brand of cold, calculated ruin." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but found she had no words, found that her carefully rehearsed speeches of vengeance and triumph had dissolved like morning frost beneath the unexpected warmth of his honesty. "So I will not defend him to you," Frederick said, setting the brandy glass down without having touched it to his lips. "Whatever he did to your father, I do not doubt that it was done with malice and without mercy, because that was the manner of man he was." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, tears she had not expected and did not want, and she blinked them back with the fierce determination that had carried her through 3 years of grief and 2 years of plotting. "But I am not my father," Frederick said quietly, and he met her gaze with something that was neither anger nor accusation, but rather a strange and terrible hope. "I offer you a choice, Eleanor. You may hate me if you wish. You may work toward my destruction if that is what brings you peace. But I ask only that we maintain civility before the world. Give me that much, and you may have the rest." She found herself nodding before she fully understood why, found herself agreeing to terms she had never anticipated, and the fire crackled its approval as the snow continued to fall outside Ravenscroft Manor, burying the world in white, while inside 2 strangers began the slow and painful work of becoming something neither had expected. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The morning after her wedding night arrived with pale winter sunlight streaming through the east-facing windows of the breakfast room, and Eleanor descended the stairs at 8 in the morning wearing a grey morning dress that matched the exhaustion she felt in her very bones after a sleepless night spent analysing every word Frederick had spoken, every expression that had crossed his face, every impossible moment of their strange and terrible conversation in his study. She had expected many things when she confessed her intentions to destroy him, had rehearsed his rage and his cruelty and his demands that she leave his house immediately. But she had not expected his quiet acknowledgement of his father's sins, had not expected the pain she glimpsed behind those grey eyes, had not expected to find herself agreeing to a truce with a man she had sworn to ruin. The breakfast room was warm despite the December chill, heated by a cheerful fire that crackled in the grate, and Frederick was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table when she entered, his attention fixed upon a stack of correspondence that he read with the focused intensity of a man who had built walls around himself so high that even his own wife could not see over them. He rose when she entered, a gesture of courtesy that cost him nothing and meant even less, and he nodded to her with perfect politeness before returning to his letters without a word beyond the requisite good morning. Eleanor took her seat at the opposite end of the table, a distance that felt deliberate and vast, and she watched him from beneath lowered lashes as a footman brought her tea and toast and a soft-boiled egg she had no appetite to eat. It was then that Mrs. Thornton entered, the housekeeper who had greeted Eleanor upon her arrival the previous day, a woman of perhaps 50 years, with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold secrets about this household and its master. Eleanor noticed how Frederick looked up from his correspondence when Mrs. Thornton approached, how his expression softened almost imperceptibly as the housekeeper inquired about his preferences for the day's menus and whether he required anything particular for his comfort. He asked after her rheumatism with genuine concern, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest as she witnessed this small kindness, this evidence that the cold Duke of Ravenscroft was capable of warmth toward those who served him. "Your Grace," Mrs. Thornton said, turning to address Eleanor with a respectful curtsy, "Miss Georgiana has written to confirm her arrival on the 19th for the Christmas holiday." Frederick's face changed at the mention of this name, something like anticipation flickering in those guarded eyes, and Eleanor tucked this information away like a card player memorizing an opponent's tells. "My sister," Frederick said, glancing toward Eleanor with what might have been an attempt at inclusion. "She is eager to meet you." Eleanor nodded and said nothing, and the silence stretched between them like the snow-covered grounds visible through the windows, beautiful and cold, and hiding whatever lay beneath its pristine surface. The library of Ravenscroft Manor stretched before Eleanor like a cathedral of secrets on the afternoon of December 17th, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking gardens that lay frozen beneath a blanket of snow that had not ceased falling since her wedding night, and she moved through the towering shelves with the careful deliberation of a woman searching for weapons in enemy territory, her mother's pearl earrings catching the pale winter light as she ran her fingers along leather spines and brass fixtures, seeking any evidence that might confirm what she had believed for 3 long years about the Sinclair family's crimes against her father. Frederick had departed that morning for estate business in the village, leaving her alone in this vast house with only servants and silence for company, and she had seized upon his absence like a gift, telling herself that this was why she had married him. This was the purpose that had sustained her through 2 years of careful planning and calculated charm. Yet as she searched through drawers and examined papers left carelessly upon desks, she could not shake the unsettling sensation that she was betraying something fragile and unexpected that had begun to grow between them in the quiet spaces of their peculiar arrangement. The guilt surprised her, unwelcome and persistent, threading through her determination like cracks in ice, and she pushed it aside with the fierce reminder that her father had died broken and destitute, that his final words had been a curse upon the name Sinclair, that she owed him this justice, even if it cost her whatever strange peace she had found in Frederick's measured courtesy and careful distance. It was in the escritoire near the windows that she found it, a hidden drawer that yielded to her persistent exploration, and within lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, correspondence between the late Duke and various associates that dated back more than a decade, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon and began to read by the grey light filtering through frost-traced glass. The words swam before her eyes at first, dense with legal terminology and financial references. She had to pass slowly, but as understanding dawned, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the physical world and everything to do with the careful architecture of hatred she had constructed around her heart. One letter in particular seized her attention, a missive from her own father to the late Duke, dated 5 years before his death, and in it he begged for assistance with debts he had accumulated through his own choices, debts he swore he would repay if only the Duke would extend him credit one more time. And Eleanor read the words in her father's own hand with growing horror as she recognized the desperate tone of a man who had brought ruin upon himself and sought to blame another for the consequences. She replaced the letters with shaking fingers, her certainty cracking like thin ice over deep water. And she stood alone in that beautiful library, surrounded by thousands of books, while everything she thought she knew about her father and his enemy began to crumble into something far more complicated than the simple story of villainy she had carried in her heart for so long. The sound of carriage wheels upon frozen gravel reached Eleanor's ears at precisely 4 in the afternoon on December 19th, and she rose from her chair in the drawing-room with a nervousness that surprised her, smoothing her hands over her skirts as she prepared to meet the sister whose name had softened Frederick's face in a way nothing else had managed during the 5 days of their strange and distant marriage, and as she descended the grand staircase alongside her husband, she could not help but notice how his usual rigid posture had loosened, how something almost like anticipation flickered in those grey eyes that had remained so carefully guarded since the night she had confessed her terrible intentions. And when the front doors opened to admit a young woman of perhaps 19 years, wrapped in a blue travelling cloak the colour of winter twilight, Eleanor witnessed something she had begun to believe impossible. Frederick Sinclair laughed, a genuine sound of warmth and welcome that transformed his austere features into something approaching joy as his sister threw herself into his arms with an enthusiasm that defied all rules of proper decorum, crying out, "Frederick, you impossible man, I have missed you terribly." And he held her close for a long moment before stepping back to present his new wife with a gentleness Eleanor had not expected from him, saying, "Georgiana, may I introduce the Duchess of Ravenscroft?" And before Eleanor could offer a proper curtsy or any of the formal greetings she had rehearsed, Georgiana seized both her hands and pulled her into an embrace that smelled of lavender and cold winter air, declaring, "I am so delighted to have a sister at last. You cannot imagine how lonely it has been, being the only female who could tolerate Frederick's brooding." And Eleanor found herself laughing despite herself, despite the guilt that gnawed at her conscience, despite the letters she had discovered and the questions they raised about everything she thought she knew, because Georgiana's warmth was impossible to resist, bright and genuine as the fire that crackled in the drawing-room hearth, where they soon settled for tea and cakes and conversation that flowed more easily than any Eleanor had experienced since arriving at Ravenscroft Manor. She watched Frederick throughout that first hour, cataloguing every smile he bestowed upon his sister, every gentle tease, every moment of protective attention when he asked about her journey and whether she had been warm enough and whether Lord Ashworth's eldest son had continued his unwelcome attentions, and she began to understand that the cold duke the world saw was merely armour, protection forged in fires she was only beginning to glimpse. And when Georgiana mentioned casually that their mother had died when she was only 10 years old, leaving Frederick at 19 to become both brother and guardian to a grieving child, Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a softening she had not permitted herself since the day her own father was lowered into a pauper's grave, and she recognized with dawning horror that she was beginning to see Frederick Sinclair not as the enemy she had sworn to destroy, but as a man who had suffered his own losses and emerged from them with a capacity for love that he showed only to those he trusted. And the question that haunted her as the fire burned low was whether she could ever deserve to be counted among that precious few. The evening of December 21st found Eleanor seated in the drawing-room with Georgiana and Frederick, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth, while servants moved quietly through the corridors, hanging boughs of holly and ivy in preparation for the Christmas celebrations that would arrive in mere days, and Eleanor found herself watching Frederick more than she watched the dancing flames, cataloguing the way his stern features softened when his sister laughed, the way his voice lost its formal edge when he teased Georgiana about her latest attempts at watercolor painting, the way he seemed almost like a different man entirely from the cold duke who had received her wedding night confession with such unnerving composure, and she wondered which version of him was the mask and which was the truth, or whether perhaps both were real, facets of a man far more complex than the villain she had constructed in her imagination during those 2 years of careful plotting and bitter grief. Georgiana yawned prettily at 9:30, declaring that the journey had finally caught up with her, and that she simply must retire or she would be utterly useless company tomorrow. And she kissed Frederick's cheek, and embraced Eleanor with the easy affection she had shown since her arrival, before disappearing up the grand staircase, leaving Eleanor suddenly alone with her husband in a room that felt both too large and too intimate, the silence between them filled with the pop and hiss of burning logs and the distant sound of servants' footsteps overhead. Frederick moved to the pianoforte that stood near the window, running his fingers absently over the keys in a melody Eleanor did not recognize, but found achingly beautiful, and she watched his hands as they moved, strong and elegant against the ivory, until her gaze caught on something she had not noticed before, a pale scar running across the back of his left hand, jagged and old, and she wondered how she had missed it during their formal dinners and careful conversations, how this evidence of past violence had escaped her attention when she had been so determined to catalogue his every flaw and weakness. He caught her staring and stilled his playing, looking down at the scar as if he had forgotten it existed, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that made Eleanor's chest tighten unexpectedly. Saying my father was not a man who tolerated imperfection, and though he offered nothing more, Eleanor heard volumes in what he did not say, recognized the careful boundaries he placed around wounds that had never fully healed, and she found herself wanting to know more, wanting to understand how the late Duke, who had supposedly destroyed her father, had also left marks upon his own son. She asked quietly if he missed his father, and Frederick's laugh held no humor as he replied that one cannot miss what one never truly had. And in that moment, Eleanor saw past the armor of his title and his wealth to the lonely boy who had grown up in this beautiful cold manor with a cruel man's expectations pressing down upon him, and she realized with dawning horror that she had married Frederick Sinclair, intending to destroy him without ever considering that he might already have been broken by someone else long before she arrived. The morning of December 22nd dawned crisp and bright, the winter sun casting long shadows across the frozen grounds of Ravenscroft Manor as Eleanor descended the staircase in her green velvet pelisse, having accepted Frederick's unexpected invitation to walk with him in the winter garden, an invitation delivered at breakfast with a hesitancy that had surprised her coming from a man who commanded rooms with his mere presence, and as they stepped outside into air so cold it seemed to crystallize in their lungs, Eleanor found herself acutely aware of how different this moment felt from the tense formality of their first days together, how something had shifted between them since Georgiana's arrival and those quiet hours by the fireplace, when he had spoken of his father with such carefully controlled pain. The garden stretched before them in shades of white and silver, frost clinging to the boxwood hedges like delicate lace, and their footsteps crunched softly on the frozen gravel path as they walked in a silence that felt almost companionable, their breath forming small clouds that drifted and dissipated in the still December air, and Eleanor gathered her courage before asking the question that had haunted her since the previous evening, inquiring gently about the scar on his hand, watching his profile as he considered whether to answer, watching the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he spoke. He stopped walking beside a stone bench that overlooked the frozen ornamental pond, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories long buried, explaining that he had been 12 years old when his father discovered him reading poetry instead of practicing his Latin declensions, that the late Duke had considered verse a waste of time for a future Duke, that he had seized Frederick's hand and pressed it against the iron fire grate until the flesh seared, and Frederick had learned, as his father put it, to remember his duties. Eleanor felt her stomach turn with horror as she listened, felt tears prick at her eyes that she fought to contain, felt the foundation of everything she had believed about the Sinclair family crumbling further beneath her feet, because the man she had married intending to destroy had been a child once, a child whose father had burned him for the crime of loving beautiful words, and she understood now why Frederick guarded himself so carefully, why his coldness was armor forged in the fires of cruelty rather than the mark of cruelty itself. She reached out without thinking and took his scarred hand in both of hers, feeling him stiffen at the unexpected contact before slowly, carefully, allowing himself to accept the comfort she offered. And when she looked up at his face, she saw something raw and vulnerable in his grey eyes, something that made her chest ache with an emotion she was not yet ready to name. They stood there in the frozen garden with the winter sun warming their faces while their breath mingled in the cold air, and Eleanor realized that she had spent 2 years hating a ghost, hating a dead man whose cruelty had touched far more lives than just her own father's, and that the son standing before her now had survived that cruelty and somehow emerged with the capacity for gentleness still intact. And she wondered if perhaps they were not enemies at all, but fellow survivors of the same storm. Christmas Eve arrived with a hush of fresh snowfall and the warm glow of countless candles illuminating every corner of Ravenscroft Manor, their flames dancing in the windows like earthbound stars as Eleanor descended the staircase in a gown of deep burgundy velvet that Mrs. Thornton had pressed with particular care, her mother's pearl earrings catching the light as she moved toward the drawing room, where she could already hear Georgiana's bright laughter and the low murmur of Frederick's voice, and she paused at the threshold to take in the scene before her. The massive Yule log crackling in the hearth, sending sparks dancing up the chimney like wishes ascending to heaven. The garlands of holly and ivy draped across the mantelpiece, the small pile of wrapped gifts that Georgiana had arranged with obvious delight near the window seat, and Frederick himself standing near the fire with his grey eyes already finding her in the doorway, something warm and unguarded flickering in their depths before he schooled his features into polite welcome. The evening unfolded with an ease Eleanor had not anticipated when she first arrived at this manor, as a bride bent on destruction, with Georgiana insisting they play cards and then abandoning the game halfway through to teach Eleanor a country dance she had learned at her friend's house in Bath, and Frederick watched them with what Eleanor could only describe as contentment, his usual reserve softened by the festive atmosphere and his sister's infectious joy. And when he laughed at Georgiana's exaggerated demonstration of a particularly complicated turn, Eleanor felt something shift and settle in her chest like a key finding its lock. After supper, Frederick produced a small wrapped parcel and pressed it into Eleanor's hands with an uncertainty that seemed foreign on a man of his position and power, explaining quietly that he had found it among his mother's things and thought she might appreciate it. And when Eleanor unwrapped the paper, her breath caught in her throat as she beheld a slim volume of poetry, its leather cover worn soft with age, and Frederick explained that he had discovered from old correspondence that her father had once given this very book to his mother when they were young, before either of them married, when they had been neighbors who shared a love of verse, and Eleanor clutched the book to her chest as tears pricked her eyes, because she remembered her father reading these same poems to her as a child, remembered his voice shaping the words like precious things, and she understood that Frederick was offering her a piece of her father untainted by the bitterness of his final years. She rose to thank him properly and found him closer than she had realized, found herself standing beneath the mistletoe that Georgiana had hung with obvious matchmaking intent, found his eyes searching her face with a question he seemed afraid to voice, and she watched his gaze drop to her lips as the distance between them narrowed to inches, to a breath, to almost nothing at all before Georgiana burst back into the room with a plate of Christmas biscuits and a cheerful exclamation that shattered the moment like thin ice, leaving Eleanor flushed and trembling and clutching her father's book, while Frederick stepped back with a rueful, almost smile that promised this conversation was far from finished. Christmas afternoon settled over Ravenscroft Manor with a peculiar hush, the snow falling so heavily outside the library windows that the world beyond seemed to have disappeared entirely, leaving only this room with its towering shelves and crackling fire, and the two of them standing on opposite sides of a truth Eleanor could no longer avoid, her fingers wrapped around her mother's pearl earrings as though they might anchor her to the person she had been before this moment, before Frederick had placed those damning ledgers on the desk between them, with hands that trembled slightly, despite his composed expression. And she stared at the familiar handwriting covering page after page of IOUs and desperate pleas for more time, more money, more chances to win back what had been lost at the gaming tables, and she recognized her father's flourishing signature on each one, the same hand that had signed her childhood birthday letters, the same hand that had penned the bitter accusations against the Sinclairs that she had treasured as gospel truth for 3 long years. Frederick stood silent as she read, giving her the space to absorb what the documents revealed, that her father had come to the late Duke not as a victim of fraud, but as a desperate gambler seeking loans to cover debts that had spiraled beyond all reason, that the Sinclair family had extended credit again and again before finally refusing to enable further destruction, that her father's ruin had been entirely of his own making, and Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her feet as everything she had built her identity upon crumbled to ash. She looked up at Frederick through eyes blurred with unshed tears and asked why he had not shown her this on their wedding night when she confessed her intention to destroy him, why he had allowed her to hate him for crimes his family had not committed, and his answer came soft and raw as he explained that he had hoped she might come to see him clearly on her own, that he had not wanted the truth to feel like a weapon wielded against her, that he understood what it meant to have a father whose actions brought shame and pain to those who loved him. The snow continued to fall beyond the windows, coating the world in white as Eleanor confronted the wreckage of her cherished beliefs. And she understood now that her father had lied to her, had twisted his own failures into a narrative of victimhood that allowed him to die believing himself wronged rather than responsible. And she had carried that lie like a sacred flame, had shaped her entire existence around avenging a wrong that had never occurred, had married a good man with poison in her heart because a dying man could not bear to tell his daughter the truth about who he really was. Frederick watched her with those grey eyes that held no judgment, only a patient compassion that made her chest ache, with something perilously close to love. And Eleanor clutched her mother's pearls and wondered how she could ever deserve the kindness he was showing her now. The words tore from Eleanor's throat before she could stop them, a confession more complete and damning than anything she had whispered on their wedding night, as she told Frederick everything. How she had spent 2 years cultivating connections that would bring her into his orbit, how she had practiced demure smiles and studied his habits and learned which drawing rooms he frequented, how she had planned to gain his trust and then systematically destroy his reputation, his finances, his standing in society, how she had imagined him brought low and ruined the way she believed his family had ruined hers, and with each word she felt herself crumbling, the architecture of hatred that had sustained her through grief and poverty, collapsing into rubble at her feet, while Frederick stood motionless by the desk, his face unreadable in the fading afternoon light. She expected him to recoil, to call for servants, to demand she leave his house immediately. But instead he moved to the window where she stood trembling, and spoke in a voice so gentle it broke something inside her, explaining that he had known about her intentions before he ever proposed, that his solicitor had uncovered her connection to Viscount Ashworth, and warned him of whispers suggesting her interest was not what it seemed, that he had married her anyway because he had seen something in her eyes at their first meeting that made him believe she was more than her vendetta, something wounded and fierce and desperately lonely that called to the same qualities he recognized in himself. Eleanor stared at him through tears that blurred the sunset painting, the snow in shades of rose and gold beyond the library windows, unable to comprehend why he had walked willingly into her trap, why he had offered kindness to a woman who had promised to destroy him, and Frederick reached out to touch her cheek with fingers that trembled slightly despite his steady voice, confessing that he had hoped love might prove stronger than lies, that he had gambled his heart on the chance that the woman behind the revenge might be worth saving, worth knowing, worth loving if she would only allow herself to be seen. The ledgers lay spread across the desk behind them, evidence of her father's failures and her own misplaced fury, and Eleanor understood that everything she had believed about herself and her purpose had been built on a dying man's inability to face his own shame, and she wept not just for the truth, but for the years she had wasted, the hatred she had nursed, the good man she had married with poison in her heart. And Frederick gathered her against his chest and held her while she shattered, his arms steady and warm around her as the last light of Christmas Day faded to twilight and the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white as if offering them both the chance to begin again with a clean and unmarked page. Eleanor did not sleep that night, lying instead in the darkness of her chamber while the fire burned low and the hours crept toward dawn, her mind turning over every moment of the past 12 days like stones in a river, smoothed and changed by the current of truth that had swept through her life and left nothing as it had been before. And when the first pale light of December 26th began to seep through the curtains, she rose from her bed without bothering to dress properly, pulling only a wool robe over her nightgown and slipping her feet into soft house shoes before padding through the silent corridors of Ravenscroft Manor toward Frederick's study, where she somehow knew he would be waiting, perhaps as sleepless as she had been, perhaps wondering if she would flee in the night rather than face what lay between them now that every pretense had been stripped away. She found him exactly as she had imagined, seated in the leather chair by the cold fireplace with the poetry book he had given her resting on the desk beside him, his cravat loosened and his hair disordered as though he had run his hands through it countless times during the long, dark hours. And when he looked up at the sound of her entrance, Eleanor saw in his grey eyes a vulnerability that matched her own. A man who had gambled everything on a woman who had promised to destroy him and was now waiting to learn whether his faith had been foolish or prophetic. She crossed the room on trembling legs, aware of how she must look with her hair unbound and her feet barely covered, and her face still bearing traces of last night's tears. But Frederick rose to meet her, as though she were dressed in finest silk, his expression shifting from guarded hope to something softer as she stopped before him and forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching from the shame that still burned in her chest. The words came haltingly at first, an apology so inadequate for the magnitude of her intended betrayal that she nearly abandoned it. But Frederick reached out and took her hands in his, warming her cold fingers, and the simple kindness unlocked something in Eleanor that had been frozen for 3 long years. She told him she did not deserve his forgiveness, but that she was asking for it anyway, that she had come to him with hatred in her heart and found instead a man worth loving, that she wanted the true marriage he had offered if he would still have her knowing everything she had been and planned and believed. Frederick lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized she was shedding, and asked her if she was certain, if she understood that he would not accept halfway measures or careful reservations, that if she chose him, it must be wholly and without the shadow of her father's lies between them. Eleanor answered by rising onto her toes and pressing her lips to his in a kiss that tasted of salt tears and dawning hope, and Frederick's arms came around her with a fierce tenderness that spoke of loneliness finally ended and trust finally earned. And outside the study windows the winter sun climbed higher over the snow-covered grounds of Ravenscroft Manor, illuminating a world made new. The morning of December 27th dawned with a softness that seemed to mirror the transformation within Ravenscroft Manor, the winter sun casting pale gold light through windows that no longer felt like barriers between Eleanor and the world, but rather frames for a future she was only beginning to imagine. And when she descended to the breakfast room at 10 in the morning, she found Frederick already seated at the table, his grey eyes lifting to meet hers with a warmth that sent heat rushing to her cheeks and made her heart stutter in a way that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks ago when she had stood before him in her wedding gown with destruction coiled like a serpent in her chest. He rose as she entered, a gesture of respect he had always performed, but which now carried a different weight, a tenderness in the small courtesies that told her everything had changed between them. And when he pulled out the chair beside his own, rather than the one at the far end of the table where she had taken her meals in cold formality, Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes for the simple gift of being wanted close. Georgiana arrived moments later, her keen blue eyes sweeping between her brother and his wife with growing delight as she observed the way Frederick's hand lingered on Eleanor's shoulder, the way Eleanor leaned almost imperceptibly toward him as though drawn by some invisible current, and the younger woman clasped her hands together with barely contained joy before declaring that she had known from the moment she arrived that they were destined to be happy together, that she had seen the way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, and had prayed every night for exactly this outcome. Frederick attempted to maintain his dignified composure, but a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as Georgiana continued her effusive celebration, teasing him about the poetry book she had seen him selecting with such care and speculating aloud about how many children they might give her to spoil as an aunt, and Eleanor found herself laughing, truly laughing, the sound strange and wonderful in her own ears after so many years of measured smiles and careful masks. The snow outside had begun to melt, rivulets of water tracing paths down the window panes, like the tears Eleanor had shed in releasing her old life. And as she reached for her teacup, her fingers brushed against the ribbon she had taken from the poetry book and now used to mark pages in her journal, a small token of the gift that had first shown her. Frederick saw her not as a conquest or a threat, but as a woman worthy of thoughtfulness and care. Frederick caught her hand and held it, his thumb tracing, gentle circles on her palm, while Georgiana pretended to be fascinated by her toast, and Eleanor understood that this was what beginning again felt like. Not the erasure of the past, but the courage to build something new upon its foundations. And when Frederick spoke of the new year approaching and asked what she wished for in the months ahead, Eleanor answered honestly that she wished only for more mornings exactly like this one. The ballroom of Lord and Lady Pemberton's estate blazed with candlelight on the evening of January 5th, 1815. Hundreds of flames reflected in crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors until the entire space seemed to shimmer with golden fire. And Eleanor stood at the threshold beside Frederick, her gloved hand resting on his arm while her heart hammered against the emerald silk of her gown with a rhythm that spoke of terror barely contained beneath a carefully composed exterior. For this was their first appearance in society since their wedding, and she knew with painful certainty that every eye in the room was cataloguing her presence, measuring her worth, and finding her wanting based on whispers that had circulated through London drawing rooms for years about the ruined Viscount Ashworth and his daughter who had somehow snared the Duke of Ravenscroft, despite having nothing to recommend her but a pretty face and a scandalous family history. She felt the weight of her mother's pearl earrings against her neck like a talisman, the only armor she possessed against the scrutiny that awaited them, and when Frederick covered her trembling fingers with his own and leaned close to murmur that she looked magnificent and that anyone who could not see her value was not worth knowing, Eleanor drew strength from the warmth in his grey eyes and allowed him to lead her into the glittering assembly where fans immediately began to flutter and heads bent together in the unmistakable posture of gossip exchanged behind silk screens and champagne glasses. Lady Harriet Montague stood near the refreshment table, her sharp features arranged in an expression of malicious delight as she surveyed the new arrivals, and Eleanor heard fragments of her commentary drifting across the ballroom like poison carried on perfumed air, references to gambling debts and disgrace, speculation about what hold Miss Ashworth must have used to trap such a prize, suggestions that the Duke had been deceived into marriage with a fortune hunter whose family name was synonymous with shame in certain circles that never forgot or forgave such spectacular falls from grace. Frederick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as the whispers reached his ears, but he maintained his composure as he guided Eleanor through the crowd, stopping to acknowledge acquaintances with the precise degree of courtesy their rank demanded, while making it unmistakably clear, through his posture and attention, that his wife commanded his complete devotion, and that anyone who wished to remain in his good graces would be wise to treat her with corresponding respect. Eleanor watched the reactions ripple through the assembly, some faces softening with genuine welcome, while others hardened with resentment at being denied the pleasure of watching the cold Duke distance himself from his unsuitable bride. And she understood that this evening would determine their place in society for years to come, that every word spoken and every glance exchanged would be analyzed and repeated until the verdict of the ton was rendered, and their fate as a couple sealed by forces neither of them could entirely control, despite Frederick's title and wealth. She gripped his arm more tightly as Lady Harriet began to move toward them with predatory grace, and Frederick looked down at her with an expression that promised she would not face this battle alone. Lady Harriet Montague approached with the deliberate grace of a predator who had scented weakness, her smile sharp as cut glass as she positioned herself directly in Frederick and Eleanor's path, and spoke in a voice pitched to carry to the eager ears of those nearby, remarking what a surprise it was to see the new Duchess of Ravenscroft venturing into society so soon after her marriage, when one might have expected her to remain hidden at Ravenscroft Manor given the unfortunate circumstances of her family's history, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the words landed like blows, each syllable designed to wound. But before she could summon a response, Frederick stepped forward with a coldness in his grey eyes that made Lady Harriet's confidence falter, his voice carrying the authority of generations, when he replied that he found it curious Lady Harriet should concern herself with circumstances when her own family's debts to various tradesmen were the subject of considerable discussion in certain circles, and that if she wished to speak of unfortunate histories, He would be happy to illuminate the assembly regarding the Montague family's creative accounting practices that had kept them one step ahead of creditors for the past decade. The silence that fell over the nearby guests was absolute. Fans frozen mid-flutter and champagne glasses sauna suspended halfway to lips as the tone witnessed the Duke of Ravenscroft, known for his cold reserve and careful neutrality, unleash a defense of his wife that left no doubt about where his loyalties lay, and Lady Harriet's face flushed crimson as she struggled to formulate a response that would not dig her deeper into disgrace, while Frederick continued, his tone softening but losing none of its steel, that the Duchess of Ravenscroft possessed more courage, integrity, and genuine worth than a dozen women of supposedly impeccable lineage, and that anyone who failed to recognize these qualities revealed only the poverty of their own character. Eleanor's hand trembled in Frederick's grip as the orchestra struck up a waltz, and he turned to her with warmth, replacing the ice in his expression, asking if she would honor him with this dance. And as he led her onto the floor, she felt the weight of 100 gazes following them. But for the first time since entering the ballroom, those gazes held curiosity and reassessment rather than contempt. And she saw several matrons nodding with apparent approval at the Duke's passionate defense, while younger ladies whispered behind their fans with what looked almost like envy. Frederick held her close as they moved through the steps of the waltz, closer than strict propriety demanded, and murmured that she should not let small minds diminish her, that she had survived trials that would have broken lesser souls and emerged with her spirit intact. And Eleanor looked up at him with tears threatening to spill from her eyes as she whispered that she did not deserve such championship, that she had come to him with poison in her heart and destruction in her intentions. He smiled then, a rare and precious expression that transformed his austere features into something approaching tenderness, and replied that what mattered was not where they had begun, but where they chose to go together. And as they turned across the gleaming floor with candlelight, catching the emerald silk of her gown and the pearl earrings that had witnessed both her darkest moments and her brightest hopes, Eleanor understood that this man had not merely defended her honor, but had claimed her publicly, irrevocably, as his own. The carriage ride back to Ravenscroft Manor passed in weighted silence, but it was not the cold distance of their early days together, rather a charged quiet filled with unspoken words and sidelong glances that spoke of things yet to be said. And when they finally entered their private chambers at 1 in the morning, with the fire already lit by attentive servants and candles casting warm pools of light across the rich furnishings, Eleanor felt as though her heart might burst from the pressure of all she wished to express to this man who had defended her honor before the most ruthless judges in English society without hesitation or reservation. And she turned to him as he closed the door and found her voice trembling when she whispered that she did not understand why he had done it, why he had risked his reputation and standing for a woman who had entered his life with nothing but hatred and schemes for his destruction. Frederick removed his gloves slowly, his grey eyes never leaving her face as he replied that there was nothing to understand except that she was his wife and that anyone who sought to diminish her would answer to him. But Eleanor shook her head and pressed further, asking how he could feel such loyalty toward her when she had confessed on their wedding night that she married him only to destroy him. And the question hung between them like a veil that needed to be torn away before they could truly see each other. He crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes and the slight tension in his jaw that betrayed emotion. His composed voice sought to conceal, and he told her that he had begun to love her before their wedding, that he had seen her at a ball 3 months before their engagement and had been struck by the dignity with which she carried herself, despite the whispers that followed her everywhere, that he had engineered their introduction through mutual acquaintances because something in her bearing had called to something broken in himself. And Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks as she realized that even her plan to trap him had been, in some measure, his plan to reach her. She confessed then that she had not known love could feel like this, like coming home to a place she had never been, like finding warmth after years of cold, and she admitted that somewhere between Christmas Eve and this moment She had stopped fighting the truth that she loved him with a ferocity that frightened her, because she did not know if she deserved such happiness after building her life on lies and vengeance. Frederick reached out and cradled her face in his hands, wiping her tears with thumbs that trembled slightly despite his steady voice, and he told her that they had both been shaped by Father Daz, who failed them, that they had both carried wounds they believed would never heal, but that perhaps together they could build something neither had dared to imagine alone. And when he kissed her this time, it was not the tentative kiss of their dawn reconciliation, but something deeper and more consuming, a promise sealed in firelight, that whatever darkness lay behind them, they would face the future as one. The morning of January 6th, 1815, dawned grey and soft over Ravenscroft Manor, but Eleanor woke to warmth she had never known, the steady rhythm of Frederick's heartbeat beneath her cheek, and the weight of his arm across her waist, anchoring her to a reality that still felt dreamlike in its tenderness. And as she lay there, watching the pale light creep across the ceiling of their shared chamber, she marveled at how completely her world had transformed in the span of 3 weeks, from a bride consumed by vengeance to a woman who had discovered that love could grow in the most unlikely soil if only given the chance to take root. Frederick stirred beside her, and she felt his lips press against her hair as he murmured good morning in a voice still rough with sleep. And when she tilted her face up to meet his gaze, she saw none of the cold reserve that had marked their early days together, only a softness that made her heart ache with gratitude for the path that had led them here, despite its thorns and shadows. They rose slowly, reluctant to leave the cocoon of their newfound intimacy, and when they finally descended to breakfast, they found Georgiana already seated at the table, with a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she observed the way Frederick held Eleanor's chair, and the way Eleanor's fingers lingered on his hand before she sat, and the younger woman declared with characteristic directness that it was about time they stopped pretending, and admitted what everyone with eyes could plainly see, that they were hopelessly besotted with each other. Frederick laughed then, that rare sound that Eleanor had come to treasure, and admitted that his sister had always been far too perceptive for her own good, while Eleanor felt a blush warm her cheeks even as joy spread through her chest like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. And she thought of how different this moment was from the breakfast they had shared on December 15th, when silence and suspicion had hung between them like a wall of ice. Georgiana announced that she would be returning to their aunt's house in London within the week to prepare for the upcoming season, and she extracted a promise from both of them that they would join her there by February, so that Eleanor could be properly introduced to society as the Duchess of Ravenscroft, not slipping in through side doors to avoid gossip, but entering through the front with her head held high and her husband at her side. And Frederick agreed with a fierce protectiveness in his voice that made Eleanor understand he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never felt diminished or dismissed again. Later that afternoon, Eleanor found herself in the library, where so much had unravelled and been rebuilt, and she stood before the window watching the last of the snow melt from the gardens while Frederick came to stand behind her with his hands resting gently on her shoulders, and she whispered that she still could not quite believe they had found their way here from such a dark beginning, and he replied that perhaps the darkness had been necessary to help them recognize the light. The days that followed Georgiana's departure on January the 10th, 1815, settled into a rhythm Eleanor had never imagined possible when she first crossed the threshold of Ravenscroft Manor, as a bride consumed by hatred. For now each morning brought the quiet joy of waking beside Frederick, and each evening offered hours of conversation before the fire, where they slowly unwrapped the layers of themselves that had been hidden for so long behind walls of self-protection and distrust, and she found herself sharing memories of her mother that she had kept locked away since childhood, while Frederick spoke of dreams he had abandoned when his father's cruelty convinced him that wanting anything was a weakness to be exploited. And in these exchanges, Eleanor discovered that intimacy was not merely the physical closeness they had found, but this gradual revelation of souls that had learned to hide and were now learning to be seen. On the morning of January 14th, exactly 1 month since their wedding night confession, Eleanor woke to find Frederick already dressed and standing by the window with an expression she could not quite read. And when she asked what troubled him, he turned to her with something vulnerable flickering in his grey eyes and admitted that he had been thinking about her father and about the weight she still carried despite all the truths that had been revealed. And he suggested that perhaps it was time for her to visit her father's grave, not to honor the lies he had told her, but to make peace with the complicated man he had been and to finally release the burden of a mission that had nearly destroyed her chance at happiness. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at his understanding, for she had not spoken of this need that had been growing in her heart, this sense that she could not fully step into her new life until she had said goodbye to the old one, and she whispered that she did not know if she was ready to face the grave of a man she had loved and hated and grieved and blamed in equal measure. But Frederick crossed to her and took her hands in his and told her that she did not have to be ready, that she only had to be willing to try, and that he would be beside her if she wished, or waiting for her return if she needed to go alone. They travelled together 3 days later to the small churchyard in Hampshire, where her father lay beneath a modest stone that bore only his name and dates, and Eleanor stood before it for a long time in silence, while Frederick waited at a respectful distance, and she found herself speaking aloud to the cold January air, telling her father that she forgave him for the lies and the gambling and the ruin he had brought upon them, that she understood now that wounded people often wound others, and that she was choosing to remember the father who had read her poetry by candlelight, rather than the bitter man who had poisoned her heart with false grievances, and when she finally turned away, she felt lighter than she had in years, as though chains she had not known she was wearing had finally fallen away, and Frederick was there to catch her when she stumbled, his arms steady and warm as she wept against his chest. Not tears of grief, but tears of release, of endings, and of beginnings. The arrival of February 1st, 1815, brought Eleanor and Frederick to London, as promised, their carriage rolling through streets that Eleanor had not seen since before her father's death, when she had been a young woman with prospects and a family name that opened doors rather than closed them. And as she watched the familiar facades of Mayfair pass by the carriage window, she felt Frederick's hand close over hers in silent reassurance, a gesture that had become as natural between them as breathing in the weeks since their reconciliation, and she marveled at how different this return felt from the bitter fantasies she had once harbored of sweeping into society as a duchess bent on destruction, for now she entered as a woman transformed by love, carrying no weapon but the truth of who she had become and the steady presence of the man beside her. Georgiana met them at Sinclair House with an embrace that nearly knocked Eleanor off her feet, and a rapid recitation of every invitation that had arrived since word spread that the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft would be in residence for the season, and Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of facing the ton's scrutiny once more. But Frederick caught her eye with a look of such quiet confidence in her that she felt her spine straighten and her chin lift, remembering how he had defended her at the Pemberton ball, and knowing he would do so again without hesitation should anyone dare to slight her. Their first days in London passed in a whirlwind of morning calls and evening entertainments, and Eleanor discovered to her surprise that the whispers which had followed her at the country ball had largely transformed into curiosity and even admiration, for the story of the Duke of Ravenscroft's unexpected devotion to his wife had spread through the drawing rooms of the ton like wildfire, and where once people had seen only the daughter of a ruined viscount, they now saw a woman who had captured the heart of one of England's most eligible and elusive bachelors, and she understood for the first time that society's judgments were as fickle as spring weather, shifting with the winds of fashion and favor rather than any true measure of worth. On the evening of February 4th, at a musicale hosted by Lady Ashworth, no relation despite the name, Eleanor found herself separated briefly from Frederick and surrounded by a cluster of young wives who peppered her with questions about her courtship and marriage, and she answered with as much honesty as discretion allowed, speaking of how she had come to know her husband gradually, and how their bond had deepened through shared conversation and mutual respect, and she realized as she spoke that every word was true, even if the full story remained their private treasure. And when she looked across the room to find Frederick watching her with warmth in his grey eyes, she smiled at him with all the love she had once thought herself incapable of feeling, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Two people who had found in each other not the destruction they had feared, but the redemption they had never dared to hope for. The morning of February the 10th, 1815, dawned grey and cold over London. But Eleanor felt only warmth as she sat in the drawing-room of Sinclair House, reviewing the guest list for the dinner party she and Frederick would host that evening, their first entertainment as a married couple, and a declaration to society that the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft were not merely united in name, but in purpose and in heart. And as she studied the names of the 24 guests who would fill their dining room, she felt a flutter of nervous anticipation that was tempered by the steady knowledge that Frederick would be beside her throughout the evening, his presence a constant reassurance that she was no longer the desperate, lonely woman who had entered his home with destruction in her heart. Georgiana breezed into the room at 10:30 with a bouquet of hothouse roses that a hopeful suitor had sent, her cheeks flushed with the pleasure of being admired, even as she declared the young man entirely too serious for her tastes, and Eleanor found herself laughing at the girl's theatrical dismissal, marveling at how natural it felt to share these moments of feminine confidence when only weeks ago she had believed herself incapable of genuine connection with anyone. The afternoon passed in a flurry of preparations, as servants polished silver and arranged flowers, and the cook sent up anxious queries about the menu, and Eleanor moved through the house with a growing sense of belonging that still surprised her, pausing at one point before the portrait of Frederick's mother that hung in the upstairs gallery, and feeling a strange kinship with this woman she had never known. This mother who had loved the man Eleanor now loved, and who had surely hoped for his happiness as fiercely as Eleanor now wished for it herself. Frederick found her there as the winter light began to fade, standing quietly beside her until she turned to meet his gaze, and in his grey eyes she saw the same tender recognition she felt whenever she looked upon any reminder of what they had both survived to reach this moment of peace. And when he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, she felt her heart swell with an emotion too vast for the small word love to contain. That evening their guests arrived to find a house transformed by candlelight and the mingled scents of roses and roasting meats, and Eleanor stood beside Frederick in the entrance hall, greeting each arrival with a composure that masked the wild beating of her heart, and she saw in the faces of lords and ladies who had once looked upon her with pity or disdain a new assessment, a recognition that the Duchess of Ravenscroft was not a woman to be dismissed, but one to be reckoned with. And as she took her place at the foot of the gleaming mahogany table and looked down its length to where Frederick sat at the head, their eyes meeting across the silver and crystal with a shared secret smile, she understood that this was the true beginning of their life together, not the wedding that had been founded on lies, nor even the reconciliation that had been born of painful truth, but this quiet triumph of two damaged hearts that had chosen each other and were now building something beautiful from the ruins of all they had lost. The weeks that followed their dinner party triumph unfolded like the pages of a novel Eleanor might once have dismissed as too fanciful to be believed, for she and Frederick had discovered in each other not merely the companionship of a well-matched marriage, but something far rarer and more precious, a meeting of minds and hearts that deepened with each passing day until Eleanor could scarcely remember the cold and bitter woman she had been when she first whispered her terrible confession on their wedding night. And as February gave way to March, and the first tentative signs of spring began to appear in the London parks, she found herself marveling at how completely her life had transformed in the space of mere months, from a creature consumed by vengeance and grief to a woman who woke each morning with joy in her heart and the warmth of her husband's arm around her waist. Frederick, too, had changed in ways that did not escape the notice of society. For the Duke of Ravenscroft, who had once been known for his icy reserve and cutting wit, now smiled readily and laughed often. and those who had whispered about the oddness of his match with the ruined Viscount's daughter now nodded knowingly and declared that love had worked its magic on even the coldest of hearts, and Eleanor treasured each small sign of his transformation, knowing that she had played a part in freeing him from the shadows of his father's cruelty just as surely as he had freed her from the prison of her own hatred. On a mild afternoon in late March, as Eleanor sat in the morning room of Sinclair House with Georgiana discussing the younger woman's upcoming debut, Frederick entered with a letter in his hand and an expression of such tender hope that Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and when he crossed to her side and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his, she felt her heart begin to race with anticipation of she knew not what. He told her then that he had received word from his solicitor regarding a small property in Kent that had belonged to her mother's family before the debts had claimed it, and that he had quietly purchased it and had it restored, and that it was hers now, a piece of her past reclaimed and given back to her as a symbol of the future they would build together. And Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she understood the magnitude of what he had done, not merely buying back a house, but restoring to her a connection to the mother she had lost and the life that had been stolen by her father's choices. She kissed him then, heedless of Georgiana's delighted gasp, and when she pulled back to look into his grey eyes, she saw there all the love she had never dared to hope for, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever trials the years ahead might bring, they would face them together, two wounded souls who had found in each other the healing they had sought in all the wrong places, and who had discovered that the greatest revenge against a painful past was not destruction, but the courage to build something beautiful in its place.